Well, good afternoon. I'm Brian Flanagan. I'm Associate Director of the Hauenstein Center here at Grand Valley. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here for our third in a series of 9 leadership luncheons this year. Couldn't be more happy to have you all with us. I'd like to start actually by welcoming some of our special guests today. First of all, Chuck Wilbur, our guest speaker. We're so glad you've joined us. We have the honor of having some of the powers that be with us today. President Tom Haas, Vice Presidents Mary Beth Wardrop, and I don't see much, but Vice President Mary Beth, thank you so much for being with us. And finally, our North Star here at the Hauenstein Center, Colonel Ralph Hauenstein. We've had 3 luncheons in a row, and it's made our semester, so thanks so much for being with us. Now we're going to be talking today about commitment. It's our leadership theme for the month. And to begin working around this idea, I'd like to share with you an excerpt from an essay by Albert Schweitzer. Now, for any students who aren't familiar, Albert Schweitzer was a German-born polymath and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he's got a pretty incredible background that any of us would aspire to. In his 20s, he was already a world-renowned musician and a scholar on Bach, one of the greatest scholars of Johann Sebastian Bach, and he believes he'll share with you the great biography written by Schweitzer if you're interested. Also in his 20s, he was a world-renowned theologian, known primarily for controversial views, his exploration of the historical Jesus. This was in his 20s, mind you. Now, when he turned 30, my age, unfortunately, when he turned 30, he decided that he was going to be a medical doctor. And so he got his education, got his MD, and then leveraged that and with his own personal resources set up basically a mission hospital in Western Africa. And for much of the remainder of his life, served. With his wife, he served some 2,000 patients in his first 9 months, and then over a 50-year career, he expanded that hospital to 50 different buildings, or 70 different buildings, I'm sorry. Now, the reason I bring up Schweitzer is he was someone famous for throwing himself into his work. He was so dedicated, he threw himself into it. He was a doctor, he was a surgeon at his hospital, he was the administrator, he was the chief fundraiser, he was the superintendent of the building and grounds, he was a pastor in the community, he was a village administrator in the community. And of course, all along, he was a world-famous philosopher, author, commentator, and musician. So pretty incredible all-around guy. Now that's all prelude to what I want to read to you here briefly. And this is out of his essay, Reverence for Life, that he wrote as a 72-year-old man in 1947. But I think it very much applies to this theme that we're talking about today. He wrote, "The ethic of reverence for life," this is what he was famous for, reverence for life, "demands from all that they should sacrifice a portion of their own lives for others. The destiny of men and women has to fulfill itself in 1,000 ways so that goodness may be actualized. What every individual has to contribute remains his own secret. But we must all mutually share in the knowledge that our existence only attains its true value when we have experienced in ourselves the truth of the declaration, 'He who loses his life shall find it.' He who loses his life shall find it." Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce someone who knows a thing or two about losing herself in a cause or two. Petra, would you like to join me up here? Petra Al-Sufi is the Vice President of our Leadership Academy. She's been with us for this is your 3rd year or your 4th year at this point? 5th or 6th, they keep. And yeah, and Petra has been a force at the Leadership Academy and just actually gave a speech at our most recent seminar about this very idea, committing yourself to the great, to something you value greatly. So Petra, without further ado, thank you so much for welcoming our guest speaker.
Thank you. This is an honor and a privilege for me to be standing here at the podium and actually kind of the other side of the leadership program that we're doing here. So I'm very honored and privileged to have gained this opportunity. And to welcome everyone here, from the Leadership Fellows to our speaker, to Vice President Mary Beth, and to all of our guests here. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, and it's my honor to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Mr. Chuck Wilbur. He gained his bachelor degree in history and his master in educational media from University of Michigan. He worked for a while with U.S. Senator Levin, and he was his chief of staff in Washington, D.C., where I want to be one day. And he was his state director in Michigan, and he was his campaign manager for 1996 and 2002 election. After that, Mr. Wilbur worked as a media specialist in Westwood Community Schools in Wayne County, Michigan, and he was a community organizer with low-income advocacy organizations in Detroit, and broadcasting journalist in the Detroit public radio station, WDET. He currently is a senior policy consultant with Public Policy Association in Lansing, and he focuses on education in Michigan and on education in the Michigan Promise Zone areas. He's also a lecturer at University of Michigan, Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and he served with Governor Granholm. He was her senior advisor for education and communication from 2003 to 2010, and he worked. His focus was on state policy, range different issues from early childhood to higher education, and he worked on her state of the state addresses. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Wilbur here, and looking forward to hearing what you are teaching us tonight about, or this afternoon, about commitments.
Well, thank you, Petra, for that great introduction. I'm really pleased to be with you today. Brian called me. Boy, I can't remember how long ago it was, Brian. I think I was still in the governor's office at the time. Yeah, and I had trouble making commitments about next week, but somehow he convinced me that I could make this long-term commitment to share some time with you, and I'm really glad he did. I feel honored to be part of a really distinguished series that you've put together. I had a chance to talk with President Haas a bit earlier, who had to run to another event, and I know what his life must be like. But I've had the pleasure of meeting him when he first came to Michigan to take this position at GVSU, and I was really honored to be part of his investiture ceremony. I told him today I'd much prefer to be wearing a suit than those robes, though. And he and I have had a special, I think, bond because I discovered in meeting him that we both at the time had children who were serving their country in the U.S. Armed Forces, and I think that brings a certain special pride that we shared together. I'm a little daunted by the task of speaking to you for 40 minutes. In fact, I should take my watch out to make sure it isn't more than 40 minutes, but because, as Petra mentioned, I'd worked on Governor Granholm's State of the State addresses. And I'm the kind of person that would probably rather be spending 40 hours writing a speech than 40 minutes actually giving one. So I hope you don't notice that distinction too much today. But I thought, given that the governor's almost out of office, I've left the administration, I could reveal a few secrets from inside the magician's cabinet, And Gleaves Whitney being here, having played that same role with Governor Engler, can I'm sure appreciate this. But when you're writing the State of the State address, and it's really a wonderful process because it's not just a speech, it really is kind of the policy definition for the state for the year ahead. And it also needs to help people in the state kind of understand in some fairly difficult times just where we are in Michigan. So these have been difficult speeches to write in many ways. But there's some fun aspects too, and the timing is always kind of a fun issue because this is something that's being broadcast on public television. So, as a governor, it's the single largest audience you get at any point in your career. The most people who are watching what you say at any one moment are in that speech. Now, it's not the same as the President's State of the Union address, which gets a much larger audience. Even the Michigan share of the President's State of the Union is a much larger audience. But in any event, it's a big deal being able to talk to them. And so, but the broadcast stations are only going to give you an hour, precisely. And then at 8 o'clock, they're going to Masterpiece Theater or Nova or something. But you're not on at 8 o'clock, So whatever you got to say, you better say it by 8 o'clock. Because you're not going to say it. So you can't really go too long. But by the same token, you put all this work into it, you want to define the agenda, you don't want to end early and let some pesky journalist from public television start telling the people of the state what this all meant. You know, you want to be the one to tell them what. So you have to precisely kind of figure out how to end that speech, you know, as the hand of the clock is like almost moving to 8 o'clock, you know. So that was a challenge. So this will not be so precisely timed today. It'll be a little less formal than that. And I am conscious that long speeches are never anybody's favorite avocation. Years ago, I heard a story about a minister who delivered a particularly short sermon on a given Sunday, and afterwards his congregation was kind of thanking him and, you know, being very, very supportive of him after the service was over. And finally, a member of the congregation said, "I want to really thank you for giving a short sermon today." And the pastor said, "Well, I'm appreciative of that. I always think it's important not to be tedious." And the member of the congregation said, "No, you were tedious, but thankfully you were brief." So I'm going to try to avoid being tedious today. And I asked you to do, like Brian mentioned to me that, you know, that giving you a reading assignment was appropriate for this presentation today. And I had to think kind of hard about it. I teach at the Ford School of Public Policy at U of M, and I have learned that the more work you give your students, the more papers you have to correct. So I'm glad I'm not taking home my homework today from this, but I hope you had a chance to do yours. Because as I thought about it, and I had to really think about, well, what article would really be relevant to the topic I want to address? And then it kind of came to me, and it made a large enough impact on me reading it. As I thought about it, I could actually think of when I'd read the article. So it wasn't that hard to find it in the New York Times archive, because I was able to think of the actual place I was when I read it, and the calendar kind of came back to mind. But it was this article, Mississippi Learning, that talked about the work of Bob Moses, who sometimes gets confused if you call him Robert Moses with Robert Moses of the Power Broker fame, if you've read or are familiar with Robert Caro's terrific book about Robert Moses, the man who kind of built modern New York City in many ways. But Bob Moses, as most people I think of him, was someone who was a hero of mine, even at a time when I didn't know his name. And I know that seems odd, and that's why I wanted you to read the article. I recently heard a radio journalist talk about Bob Moses and referred to him as the most important civil rights leader you've never heard of. And I thought that was so fitting for Bob, because he was someone in the 60s who wasn't, and I'm not saying this to denigrate anyone else, he wasn't a speech giver, he was an organizer. He was the person who worked behind the scenes to make big things happen, important things happen. And he was never concerned with being the name in the newspaper. And so he came through that period with a tremendous amount of respect from people that knew him, but almost none of the celebrity we often associate with public life in America. And so I thought that reading about him, and particularly his evolution, would speak to the issue of commitment, and what commitment means when you measure it not just over a period of months and years, but over decades. And I think it's such a great story. And since not all of you were given that homework assignment, I'll try to summarize some of it in my remarks. But I wanted to, for the purpose of the students here, kind of take you back for a moment to that place in time where Bob Moses became an important person in American history. Now, looking at you and realizing that you students, I think, are all at least a year or two younger than my youngest child, which probably means your parents are also younger than I am. So you may not have gotten the full brunt of 60s lore growing up as my wife and I have inflicted on our children. But this was a very unique time period in the nation's history, a very challenging time. And it dawned on me earlier this year when the clock turned to 2010, that 2010 also meant that the 60s were turning 50. You know, it was 50 years since that decade began, and that those of us who lived through it, we're going to go through a lot of retrospective thinking, but those of you who didn't live through it, we're going to be subjected to an amazing amount of anniversary coverage of famous things that happened 50 years ago. I have a good friend in politics who relocated from Michigan to Seattle, And Dwight told me years ago that when he got there, one of the things he enjoyed about it, there was a kind of a frisky group of young political activists in the city, and they called themselves jokingly the Society for the Advancement of Time. And their motto was they were going to end the 60s in their lifetime. So we're going to cut across that grain a little bit today and talk about it. But I think it's important to realize that in that decade, in a decade of a lot of turmoil, there were a lot of heroes. And some of them are people that we all know. I mean, you know, we had a dynamic young president cut down in an assassination. We had the first man who walked on the moon. We had a martyred civil rights leader. So there's people who were genuine heroes who we all know and respect. But there were plenty of heroes whose names we never knew. I was so glad that Gleaves did his tribute to veterans at the beginning of the program because, you know, during the 60s, a lot of the men and women who fought and died in Vietnam were heroes who didn't even get appreciated at the time. In part because I think we had trouble as a society separating our feelings about the war from our feelings about the people who fought it. And I think we haven't made that mistake since then. But and there were also heroes who worked in the civil rights movement, and Bob Moses was one of those heroes. I think that there's a line in a song by Bob Dylan, one of Dylan's best songs, that I think always to me summarized their strength. These were people who fought in a different war, and their weapon was nonviolence. Their weapon wasn't a gun, it wasn't a bomb, it was nonviolence. And they were willing to face down violence organized not just by individual citizens against them, but by the very state itself, by the police apparatus of the state that was arrayed against them. And they were willing to meet that with nonviolence. Dylan, in a song that I think is one of his best, a song called Chimes of Freedom, had a line about them that talked about the warriors whose strength is not to fight. And that's a powerful concept. And to realize that in that time, hard for us to imagine now, you know, as in the kind of shadow of 9/11, where terrorism is something that we think of as a threat that our country faces from others abroad. But to realize that millions of American citizens in the 60s and the decades that preceded the 60s were living in an atmosphere of terrorism. Unspeakable violence would be used to deny them their basic rights as American citizens. Hard for us to imagine. You know, you may think I'm being hyperbolic by using the word terrorism. But what is terrorism? I don't know what the Webster's definition is, but I think any practical definition of the term, we would see terrorism as the use of violence, often against innocent people, for the purpose of achieving political ends. And for African Americans who lived in the South during those decades, that was the reality they faced every day. And again, it wasn't just the violence of a few extremists. It was violence that was supported by, tolerated, even legitimized in some ways by the courts, by the political structure. So that was the world that Bob Moses and the other people he worked with confronted in 1964. If there was a Gettysburg in the battle for civil rights in the United States, it was that summer. It was Mississippi Freedom Summer, the summer of 1964. And Moses, if you read the article, had gone to Mississippi himself earlier, had kind of tested the waters for several years before that. And you know, what was the radical act that he and others had traveled to Mississippi to do? To register people to vote. The most fundamental right we think we have as Americans, the ability to vote. And that was the act that put them up against the violence of that society. And so Mississippi Freedom Summer was a very calculated strategy. Calculated in part because the organizers, Moses and others who made it happen, understood that the only way America would know what was going on and what this closed society was that they were facing in Mississippi was that people from the North subjected themselves to those risks, particularly white people from the North. That in a racially polarized environment, if that issue didn't cross the color line, it was never going to have the impact on American society that it needed to have. So it was a very conscious strategy to come to college campuses, including some in this state, and recruit young people who would spend their summer registering people to vote, teaching young African American children in institutions that at the time were called freedom schools, teaching them Black history for the first time in their lives. So it was an incredible moment in American history, and I really do encourage those of you who have a bent for history to delve into it. The Taylor Branch series on Martin Luther King, America in the King years, is a terrific way to look at it. There's a brand new book that's just out on Freedom Summer, and there's a lot that's been written about that period. But that was the period that Bob Moses kind of came through and developed this almost messianic reputation among the people that he worked with. In fact, as the article noted, at one time he had to adopt a different name because the name Moses just conjured up too many images for people, and it kind of added to the myth. And as an organizer, he didn't want to be the myth. He wanted to be somebody who got the job done. And so he adopted his mother's maiden name for a while as kind of a nom de guerre in doing the work he was doing in Mississippi. But in any event, as the story was told in the article, he went through this intense experience, and as you can imagine, he kind of suffered a little burnout as that summer ended. And just to not dwell on all the details of the history, but really, if there was an end point to Mississippi Freedom Summer, it wasn't in Mississippi. Ironically, it was in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the Democratic Party was holding its convention that summer to nominate for the first time Lyndon Johnson, who would assume the presidency when President Kennedy was assassinated. And this was the nomination for Johnson's first and, as it turned out, only elected term as president. And at that convention, as a result of the work that Bob Moses and other people had done, a delegation traveled by bus from Mississippi to Atlantic City to challenge an all-white segregationist delegation that claimed that it represented Mississippi in the Democratic Party, as it had every convention before that throughout the 20th century. And so this organizing vehicle that was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was an integrated party, black and white leadership, showed up in Atlantic City and said, we want to be seated as the legitimate delegation representing the people of our state. And it was a huge moment of crisis in the Democratic Party. The president wanted to be nominated, and all presidents want to be coronated. They don't want to just be nominated. I mean, they want this to all go well. The conventions weren't quite the neat infomercials that they've kind of evolved into over the years at this time. They were a little ragged around the edges. But nobody wanted it to be this ragged. Nobody wanted a major confrontation played out on television all across the United States. And so the leader who came through that period and was the spokesperson, and I suspect she was somebody who Bob Moses perhaps helped make into a leader, was a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer, who famously said when a compromise was offered to the Mississippi Freedom Democrats that they allow the segregationist delegation to be seated, but that they would accept 2 non-voting seats as a consolation prize. And Fannie Lou Hamer's famous words from that day is, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats." And the deal was rejected by the leadership of her organization. And that was kind of the end point. Now, funny thing's the way history works. That moment that must have felt like a defeat to the people who literally risked their lives that summer to make it happen, was instead kind of a turning point. There was never a segregated delegation seated at another Democratic Party convention after 1964. The party couldn't make that change instantaneously as the demand was being made, but that change became a permanent and fundamental change in the party afterwards, and had a similar effect, I think, ultimately on the Republican Party. So it was a moment of that might have seemed like failure, but historically you could also look at it and say it was a moment of triumph. So Moses went through that whole experience, kind of burned out, ended up leaving the country for a number of years, lived in Tanzania, and then came back to Boston and resumed the graduate studies that he had interrupted to join the movement in the early 60s. So he kind of came back and his life kind of cycled around again. So now he's a good bit older, he's a parent, and his kids are studying math in Cambridge schools. And he's actually horrified at the way they're being taught math. And as he gets into the school and sees how kids are relating to this process, he comes to realize that mathematics education and mathematical illiteracy is, in a sense, defining itself as a civil rights issue. that in particular, if he looked at how minority children were being taught mathematics, or more properly, how they were being failed to be taught mathematics, that he saw this huge barrier being constructed to prevent them from becoming really first-class citizens. That, and even if we think that math is not something we all use in our daily lives, we don't always reach back to our Algebra 2 textbooks, in our lives as adults. But the process, the logic, the problem solving, the whole set of higher level thinking skills associated with that process becomes a gateway. And if that gate opens to you, then life opportunities open to you. And if that gate is closed to you, you're relegated into second-tier jobs, even with a college education. So to Moses, this became kind of the issue that kind of reconnected his life. And to me, and as the reason this article I think meant so much to me at the time, I recall kind of grappling in my own life with trying to figure out where my activism was going to be focused. And reading the story about Bob Moses and how he went from somebody who had in some ways just gone back to his normal life, but there was just something about him that couldn't keep him out of the battle. He was going to be in the battle one way or another. But what he did in the 80s and then into the 90s, and now he's doing it yet today, is to rejoin the battle in a different way. And he rejoined it as a mathematics educator and invented something called the Algebra Project, which around the country has really kind of revolutionized the way people look at math education. I'm not a math educator. I couldn't tell you good mathematics pedagogy from bad, so I have to trust other people in this regard. But people I do trust say he's been an incredibly influential figure, and he's focused attention on the achievement of young people. And just yesterday there was a new study out on the racial gap in American education that was really kind of startling in terms of the ratio of African American students who were never able to attain a college education, who never graduate from high school. And these are the issues that Moses decided to confront as an educator. So for me, coming into, and I read this article that I had you read just recently, I read that article when it was published in 1993. I was kind of at a point in my life where I'd done a lot of political activism and had kind of retreated into other vocations. And it really helped me kind of reconnect with what I wanted to do and what I saw the long-term commitment I wanted to make to change. And so I thought it was worth sharing with you because there were some other C words, not just commitment, that kind of came out. Brian told me we have a very disciplined here. You always like to have one word. But I thought there were two others that were important with that word commitment, that the words were change and consistency. And we often in politics and in life think of these as words that kind of can be in conflict with each other. In fact, in politics, if a politician changes his mind, it's a flip-flop. It's a terrible thing, right? And you're going to beat him up in a television ad about it every chance you get. But sometimes we change our minds because we grow. Sometimes we change our minds because the facts present themselves differently. The problem defines itself differently. And so we can change and be consistent at the same time. We can be consistent to underlying core values that are important to us while the circumstances of the day change. And so I thought I saw in Bob Moses a model that we can all look to somebody who completely redefined the battle. From registering people to vote up against the violence of the state of Mississippi to challenging the way mathematics education is done in a Boston classroom. I mean, those seem like totally different battlefields, but to Bob Moses, it was the same fight. It was the fight for full citizenship for all Americans. And so I kind of looked at that and thought, this makes sense, And at a time when I was kind of making some transitions in my own life, I really thought I should look for opportunities to exercise some leadership in the area of education reform. And just as Moses had to kind of reorient himself, I found that I had to wade into the water where it wouldn't always be comfortable. Because as a Democrat, and probably someone who more often than not would have been on the left side of the Democratic Party, I found myself making bedfellows with people in the other party, and not always on the moderate side of that party, because the Republican Party had embraced some education reform ideas that Democrats were slow to embrace. But for me, it was a question, what am I going to do? Am I going to be consistent to what I think of as the issues of politics, or am I going to be consistent to what I think of as my core values as a human being? And I think that's the challenge that all of us face in these issues. You can't predict the situations you're going to be thrown into professionally, politically, socially in your lives. The only thing you have to rely on consistently are those core values you have as a human that hardly ever define themselves in simple political terms. They don't define themselves as Democrat or Republican. They don't define themselves as liberal, conservative, socialist. They don't fit the isms typically. They are somehow underneath that, closer to your core as a person. And I think that, and that's where I think commitment needs to be rooted. Those of us who are committed to an issue or to an ideology, I think, are usually failing to connect to what's really important in our own lives. And so that's where I thought the Moses story was a story about commitment, but also a story about change and consistency around that commitment. Now for me, the opportunity kind of arose, after reading this article, I was involved for a good while dealing with education finance reform in Michigan as we were working to try to develop a better system of funding our schools. At the time that I became involved in that issue, in Michigan, we had a ratio of spending between our highest spending school districts and our lowest spending school districts that was about 3 to 1. Now, at the time, I recall reading, and this is when the struggle against apartheid was still underway in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela had been released from prison, but they had not yet established a majority government. That at the time, under apartheid, the ratio of spending, and this is in a legally sanctioned system of segregation, the ratio between spending on African children and white children was a 4 to 1 ratio under apartheid. And we had gotten to a 3 to 1 ratio in Michigan under our school finance structure at the time. Obviously something was wrong, and we were able to make some important changes in the state to address that, and we've still got a lot of work to do on that front. But for me, it was a way to brought me in to work on education reform as an issue. I continued to have that interest, and while I worked for Senator Levin throughout most of the 90s, and then along the way, somewhat by chance, and it's the role that kind of serendipity plays in our lives, I was living in Detroit. My kids were in Detroit public schools, and like a lot of parents in that situation, there was no way to be passive about that. You couldn't just send your kids to school and know that everything would turn out all right. You had to be an involved parent. It was an involved choice to use the Detroit schools at the time, and our kids went to a magnet school that we thought was a good school. But we also knew it was a school that was constantly being threatened by the district bureaucracy. Anytime it did something different that was good for kids, it was breaking someone's rule somewhere. And so we really struggled as parents for what kind of education our kids could get in that city. And as we struggled with it, we formed kind of a neighborhood organization. And at the time, everybody in that group were parents, really, of school-age children, except these 2 people who were in the group who had just relocated to our neighborhood. A guy by the name of Dan Mulhern, a woman by the name of Jennifer Granholm. And they were the only people in our group that didn't have children in the schools. Didn't have children at all at that time. They had just returned to Michigan. They both graduated from Harvard Law School. And so they were our neighbors, they were our friends, and they were our comrades in this struggle for education reform in the city, even though they didn't have a vested self-interest in it that I did as a parent. For me, the issue was if I couldn't get my kids into a school that I felt comfortable with, was I going to have to move somewhere else? And a lot of other people faced that same challenge. And so we kind of formed a partnership in those years around the core set of values about education. And at the root of those values was the belief that schools needed to be about kids. And they could also be about adults, but they had to be about kids first. And then if we could make schools work for kids, then we could figure out how to make schools work for adults around that. But too often in our schools, the opposite had happened. The adults were people who could vote, the adults were people who had money, the adults were people who had representation, and so schools became about them. And dealt with kids became almost like a secondary concern. And so that was kind of our core belief. And I didn't know in those days when we had developed this partnership that one of us was going to become governor of the state of Michigan. It wasn't me, as you may have noticed, but and so I was really pleased at about this time of year, actually, in 2002, after Governor Granholm had become, well, at that time she was Governor-elect Granholm, called me and said, I would like you to be part of this team we're putting together in Lansing. And so that began kind of a really incredible journey for me through the next 7+ years of being able to work with the governor on a whole set of education issues. When we came into office, No Child Left Behind had just been kind of promulgated in Washington. And that was a policy that was associated with President Bush. So he wasn't associated with our party. And a lot of people in our party disliked it. Some of them disliked it as policy. Some of it disliked it because of its source. Senator Ted Kennedy was also one of its authors as well, so we always thought the source was mixed. But I remember going to the governor at that time, and we had the first set of results based on No Child Left Behind that showed this large number of schools we had that were going to be called failing schools. And as a policy advisor, I presented the issue to the governor with my recommendation. But I also let her know that if she wanted to, we didn't have to take ownership of that. These stats that were developed based on those schools really measured education that had happened under her predecessor. This didn't have to be our issue to own. And her response, which pleased me but didn't surprise me, was, we only have one governor at a time. I'm the governor. I have to take responsibility for this. And so what we announced when we released that data to the media was not that these were Michigan's failing schools, but that they needed to be Michigan's high priority schools. That this needed to be our focus because those kids deserved a better education. In the end, the way we handled the issue and talked about it and framed it, the National Governors Association made it a model for other states about how they should address the issue of accountability. Because it was a moment for us to define ourselves. And in the political world, the Republican Party had been associated more with accountability in education. And the Democratic Party, rightly or wrongly, had been associated more with the education status quo. And we were determined that we were going to be pro-accountability Democrats. And that's who we were going to be. Because to us, it connected to our deepest values, that value of the children. And so that really was the first of the issues we confronted over a period, and I worked for the governor for a little over 7 years, that ranged a whole parcel of issues that we dealt with over that time. All of them connected back, and we felt, to the question of how do we guarantee each Michigan child the best education we can. Along the way, we found some different framing for that issue. Because the economic situation, as it deteriorated in the state, it became clear to the governor that we would not succeed as a state unless we raised our level of educational attainment. We discovered that Michigan was about 2 points below the national average in terms of the percentage of our population with a BA degree or better. And as we looked at that issue, we said, well, 2 points below average, that doesn't sound that bad. And then as you looked at it more carefully, you said, well, wait a minute, how are the best states doing? And we were 10, 12, 13, 15 points behind the best states in the country in educational attainment. And lo and behold, when you looked at the economies of those states, what did you find? Lower rates of unemployment, higher rates of personal income growth, greater rates of business investment. In fact, at the time, we were being told in many circles that the business people making investment decisions, the educational quality of the workforce was more important to them than the state's tax policy. Now, that doesn't mean you can ignore tax policy. You never can. But it signaled that a different kind of investment, a different kind of commitment to raising educational levels across the board made sense. The governor appointed a commission. It became known as the Cherry Commission. It was officially the Lieutenant Governor's Commission on Higher Education and Economic Growth. It made a series of recommendations that shaped our policy for the next 3 or 4 years. We went from having some of the weakest high school graduation requirements in the country to some of the most rigorous, and the young people who are sitting in our schools today in Michigan who will graduate this June will be the first group that had to meet those higher standards. And it included, back to Bob Moses, Algebra 2 for all students in Michigan to get a high school diploma. And that was a controversial issue. We actually kind of had enough momentum that we steamrolled it through the legislature without anybody really thinking about it too much. Sorry to admit that happens. It does, all too frequently. Sometimes it happens, and it's a good thing, in my view, in this case. But then the legislature, like any other body, can have buyer's remorse. And so there were some people that started to say, gee, do we really want all our kids? And I remember one of the great lines, well, all our kids aren't going to be biophysicists. And I'm thinking to myself, what does it have to do with that, you know? And then one of our opponents on this issue, this is always a story I enjoy, actually thought, well, I'll show them, and developed like a little Algebra 2 exam and asked members of the legislature to take this exam, and then was able to demonstrate that members of the legislature couldn't do Algebra 2. And as I sat there thinking about this, and we can't get the budget balance, so is he proving his case or is he proving our case? And I really thought he was proving our case pretty effectively, and so far we've been able to withstand that backlash, and I think we've got enough momentum now that we'll keep these tougher standards in place. They're some of the toughest standards in the country, but if we want our state to lead in this category, we're not going to do it by wanting to be third best or fourth best or 10th best. We've got to be best. So we did that. And some of you actually, depending on when you went through high school, may have actually lived through this change. We threw the MEP test out the window in high school and replaced it with a test based on the ACT. So for the first time in Michigan over these last few years, every single student who graduates from high school has a college entrance exam score. Now, why is that important? Because when we've done this here and in other states, when all kids get college entrance exam scores, kids start to think about going to college who never thought of it before. What a simple, low-hanging fruit strategy for being able to get more people to go to college. So that was one of the reforms we passed. We believe that you didn't just raise the bar for students, you had to create new strategies for success. So we were able to get some grant funding to create small high schools to replace failing high schools in Michigan. And one of the, unfortunately, the best kept secrets in the state, we created a new type of high school in the state that we have 7 of right now, called an early college high school. And early college high schools take students out of 8th grade as they're leaving 8th grade, and these are typically students we think of at risk of not finishing high school. And instead of just putting them in a normal high school program, we put them in an integrated 5-year program that brings them in as 9th graders. At the end of 5 years, they will have earned a high school diploma, they will have earned an associate degree, and in the initial group of schools we did, all had connections to major medical centers in the state. So they would have done internship and externship experiences during those 5 years, so most of those students would be able to leave that associate degree program and go directly into a good paying job at a major medical provider. It's a totally different way of looking at the high school experience, and it's based on our understanding that every time we have a seam in the education system, we have leakage through that seam. So when students make transitions, we lose them. So this is a seamless system that takes them from 8th grade to a college degree. And the people who've worked with them as 8th graders, 9th graders, continue to work with them all the way through that program as people. And it's a much better strategy for not just getting people through high school, but getting them through college. One of the issues we discovered in all this work is that we have a problem in Michigan that I would call the college dropout problem. We never talk about the college dropout problem. We talk about the high school dropout problem. We have and we're not unique in this. This is a problem that exists in most of the states. But if we factor out a couple of our most selective higher education institutions in the state and take the rest of our state universities, only about half of the students that attend our state universities earn a degree over a 6-year period of time. Half of them do not. For first generation to college students and minority students, when we look at those subgroups, the performance is shocking, frankly. One of our major state universities in the state that really, I think, has prided itself on opening the door of educational opportunity to minority students, less than 1 out of 10 African American students who attend that institution earn a degree within 6 years. That's a problem. And that's a problem that we've been spotlighting and we need to address. There's a whole series of reform measures that we were able to pass out of the Cherry Commission. This past year, we were able to enact another series of reforms. In this case, the impetus didn't come from our own commission, but it came from the President's leadership in Washington and Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. You may have heard of the Race to the Top process. Some of you have heard of Race to the Top? Okay. You may have heard Michigan didn't get the funding in Race to the Top, and that was a disappointment. But what Race to the Top was an attempt by Secretary of Education with a very ambitious agenda to kind of hit the states up the side of the head with a 2x4 and say, if you want to be part of what we're doing in Washington, you've got to pass some reforms in your state. And the real benefit to Michigan will come from those reforms. It would have been nice to have the funding too, would have eased the process of implementing some of those reforms. But the real payoff for us was the reforms. Charter schools have been a contentious battle in Michigan for 15 years now or more. We passed some really, I think, sound charter school reform legislation that took a cap that we have on charter schools in Michigan and said we will relax that cap anytime a school hits a certain standard of quality. Some people now call it a permeable cap or a smart cap. So we kept some controls in that area, but we said we don't want to limit high-quality schools. We want more high-quality schools. At the same time, we said we would close low-performing charter schools. So we're kind of closing the low performers, inviting the high performers to clone themselves. It's probably some of the best charter school legislation in the country. We changed the law to give the state a more aggressive role. A lot of that focused on Brian's dad, the state superintendent, Mike Flanagan, to be able to intervene in the lowest performing schools in the state. So when I step back and look at what we've done, I believe that we have laid the groundwork for some fundamental change in education in Michigan that really parallels a lot of work we've done on the economic side. And in wrapping up here, because I do want to take a few questions, I've had the extraordinary chance, when we talk about commitment, to work with a leader in Governor Granholm whose commitment is unshakable. Most of us could not deal with the inherent disappointment of leading a state at a time when national and international forces have devastated our major industries. We have lost in the last 10 years in Michigan, going back to 2000, we've lost close to 1 million jobs, almost 1 out of 5 jobs in the state. There have been a few other places in the United States that have encountered job loss like that. North Carolina's loss of the textile industry would be an example. Often it's global forces that are making those changes happen, but they fall heavily on states that are concentrated in certain sectors of the economy. But I will tell you this, through it all, the governor never loses her zip, never loses her commitment and her ability to go out the next day and make something happen. And one of her favorite expressions is, you've got to be willing to plant a tree even though you know you'll never be the one who enjoys its shade. And I know that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we'll still be reaping some of the benefits of the seeds we planted in the economy today that just take a while to ripen. But it's been an incredible experience for me. And I think back to that day I read that Robert Moses article and thought, it helped me really refocus my life and decide that my commitment was to a set of values. It wasn't to a party per se, it wasn't to a political ideology, but it was to a set of basic values that I think I'd had for a long time, and that I could find a way to be a leader around those issues and around those values. Now, for you, since I spent all this time talking about the past and about me, let me just close in talking just for a moment about the future and about you, because there's amazing opportunities for you to make a difference on these issues. I was able to take this into the policy realm and to be able to have some impact on some larger issues, but a lot of this work needs to be done at the micro level, with individual kids. And so there's programs out there today that are really challenging your generation to be committed to this issue of education. Teach for America is probably the best known of these programs that reaches out to young people. Are you clapping for that one, Annie?
I just got accepted yesterday.
Oh, congratulations. No, that is a huge achievement. I mean, we won't put Annie on the spot, but Teach for America is one of the most selective things. You could probably get into half of the high-powered graduate schools in America and not get into Teach for America, right? I mean, it's congratulations. I mean, my youngest child got rejected last year, got to the final stage, got to the finals, and was just heartbroken. But, he's 21, you bounce back about 24 hours later, but found his way to a similar program called the New Teacher Project, which runs fellowship programs in about 15 states, and is now a first-year teacher in Phoenix, working with the New Teacher Project and doing their work. So it's very similar, very similar to Teach for America, but a different project. So those are just a couple of examples, and that's to become a classroom teacher. But there's other programs. There's City Year, which has people working in urban environments around the country. A lot of that work intersects with education. There's AmeriCorps. There's other ventures out there that are out there for your generation to engage in. And I want to just close with these notes. This whole talk today got me thinking a bit about history. If any of you have read W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks, published in 1903, and Du Bois was such a visionary. There at the start of that new century, he said, in these words I think have rung true in history, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And looking at that both in the United States and in the anti-colonial struggle around the world, he was certainly right about that. In this century, the problem may well be the education line. But unfortunately, that line that divides the education haves from the education have-nots, unfortunately, that line itself is still mixed up in the lines of race and class. So it's not just purely an education issue. But together, that, I think, in a lot of ways, is the challenge facing your generation. And I hope for some of you, where you find your commitment rooted as we go forward as a country. I want to thank you for having the chance to talk with you today. So Brian, it's right to take some questions, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Easy questions. No. Yes? Hi.
Hi. You talked about college dropout rate.
Right.
In my mind, just from students that I've talked to and my friends as a college student, I think a lot of that is connected to money and paying for school. And when the money runs out, you have to get a job and working and going to school. It's very tiresome. You run out of steam. You don't have that same commitment to your education. When you're taking 15 credit hours and you're also working 15 hours a week. So considering that, I'm wondering if you could just talk about what it was like at the time of the Promise Scholarship cut.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question.
I think it's an easy question first.
No, it's not an easy one, Ashley, but it's an important question, and I'm going to use it to talk a little bit about my new day job too, if I could, working on a concept we call Promise Zones. But the Promise Scholarship was something that grew out of the work we did at the Commission on Higher Education, because the fundamental conclusion of the Cherry Commission was that we needed to make post-secondary education in Michigan universal. Now, we think we've made high school education universal, and we still have a dropout problem, okay? But imagine the dropout problem we would have if people had to go out and find money to pay for their junior or senior year of high school, right? I mean, we'd have a heck of a dropout problem, right? So here we felt that if we're going to articulate a value, that post-secondary has to be universal. And let me clarify that. That's a continuum. That continuum could have a Harvard PhD on one end of the post-secondary continuum, and it could have a 6-month phlebotomy course that allows somebody to get a job drawing blood in a hospital, which hopefully won't be their last job, but their first job in that system. Okay, so it's a range of post-secondary options. But if we truly want to make that a universal expectation, then we have to start adjusting the way we finance higher education and scholarships to match that. And so in a small way, and these are always small incremental struggles in government, we took a scholarship that was created by Governor Granholm's predecessor as a merit scholarship, and we tried to redefine it. In the political process, that wasn't easy, but we succeeded to the point we felt it really had become a universal scholarship. Some people could qualify for it by doing well on a high school exam, the MEP and then later the ACT. Other students could qualify for it kind of through more of a sweat equity approach. Okay, I didn't test well in high school, but now I'm in community college, look how I'm going to do. And so we had kind of different ways to win. And in doing that, we thought we took a scholarship that was really somewhat limited by being solely based on a high school test and by making it more widely available. At the moment, the legislature, much to our chagrin, or disgust might be a better word, defunded the Michigan Promise Scholarship. We had the first group of students who were going to get their entire $4,000 scholarship on the back end, because they had gone to college, they had done everything we'd asked them to do, and they had earned an associate degree, even though they didn't do well on the high school test. And isn't that what we want? I mean, we want every student. We don't want to say, oh, you weren't an early bloomer in 11th grade, so we're done with you. We felt that was like old world thinking on this issue, and that our thinking had to look at every student's potential. And I think every parent knows this, certainly every educator does. Young people blossom and bloom at different times. And for some students, they actually had to go out into the job market after high school, only with a high school diploma, and say, this is terrible. How do you make any money, you know? And then they want to go to community college and get an associate degree. So that was a real, I'm going to be honest with you, that was a real low point to us, that we were not able to bring the political leadership sufficiently in either party to value this transformation. And I wish the new governor well in this, and I think he paid a visit to the Ford School, where I teach, not too long ago, and his interest is in perhaps making the Michigan Promise Scholarship more needs-based than it's been, which is something we would have supported from the get-go, really, in our administration, but we couldn't get the other party to agree to that. He's in the other party, and he already thinks that. So there may be some new opportunities that he has as a governor to be able to transcend the partisan divide on that issue and to move us someplace that we were not able to get. And I was talking to Gleaves coming in today. You know, we only have one governor at a time in Michigan, and we all need that governor to succeed, no matter which party we think we happen to belong to. And so we wish him well on that issue. Now, as for my day job, I'm working on this from a different angle. And I'm sure most of you have heard some little bit, at least, about the Kalamazoo Promise. Okay. Besides this being the Marine Corps' birthday today, it's the Kalamazoo Promise's birthday too, although the Kalamazoo Promise isn't quite as old. But 5 years ago today, it was announced in Kalamazoo that because of the generosity of anonymous donors, that every child who graduates from the Kalamazoo public school system would have the opportunity to attend any state university or community college in Michigan tuition-free. And that announcement has really revolutionized that community. Now, it didn't mean that Kalamazoo escaped the recession. I mean, those are some pretty huge macroeconomic forces, but they've weathered the recession better than most parts of the state, significantly so. And when we come out of the recession, they're going to be poised to make that city a center of activity in a knowledge economy. Because again, the employers, the investors who want to come to a community, they want to be someplace where there's an educated workforce. Not just today, but an educated workforce tomorrow. Kalamazoo is going to be that city. I'm working on a project that we started under the governor's leadership called Promise Zones. We got bipartisan legislations passed in 2008 with strong support in both parties to create 10 communities in Michigan that could replicate the Kalamazoo Promise. We're doing it a little differently. Our challenge was to do it without the billionaires. Not that we have anything against billionaires. We like them, and we wish we had one in every Michigan town. But the reality is we don't. And so there has to be a different way to skin that cat to be able to guarantee. And so, Ashley, back to your original question, which I hope you don't think I was ignoring. We need to do more so that every child grows up knowing that a college education is there for them. This issue of educational attainment is a cultural issue in many ways. And in Michigan, for the second half of the last century, you could have a pretty good life in Michigan without a lot of formal education. And that in itself created a cultural legacy that became a burden in this century. Because in this century, it's pretty clear, if you don't have a good education, you are not going to have a normal, nice, middle-class life. It's not going to happen. And so we've got to shed that cultural legacy from one period of success for us, or we're not going to find success in this next period. And we think these promise zones, like the Kalamazoo Promise, kind of take a community and shake it up and say, we're going to have a ubiquitous commitment to post-secondary education for all of our kids. And we think that's the answer. So you have to, but it's kind of a community by community fight. We wish we could do it everywhere sooner, but we are starting with some of the poorest communities in the state where the problem maybe is most severe. And from there, hopefully we can spread. But I appreciate your question. Okay.
Thank you, Chuck.